Throughout the election cycle, you likely heard the Harris campaign and Democrats sound the alarm about so-called Project 2025. It's a far-right presidential transition plan drawn up by a conservative think tank called the Heritage Foundation. As a candidate, former President Trump and his team tried distancing themselves from the extreme policies, but many of its authors are former members of his 2016 administration. Philip Bump joins us now. He's a national columnist for The Washington Post who has written extensively about Project 2025. Philip, thanks for being here. First, can you give us a reminder of some of the policy positions and also why you wrote in July about the, quote, impossibility of separating Trump from Project 2025?
I would say there are probably two components to Project 2025 that are important to keep in mind. The first is that it proposes an overhaul of what the federal government looks like and how it functions. That includes something that Donald Trump had tried to do when he was last in office, which was recategorize a lot of federal employees so it'd be easier to fire them, with the idea that Trump and his allies have said of replacing a lot of longtime government employees with people who would be more pliant, who would be more in agreement with Donald Trump's personal political agenda. The other side of it, and that, there are other aspects of what would happen in the federal government, but that's really the thrust of it. The other aspect of Project 2025 is doing a lot of social issues and a lot of changes from the federal government down, really leveraging federal power to the extent that it can to try and affect change at the social level. So to change, for example, one of the things that's been isolated and was actually a target of advertising during the campaign was, perhaps putting new limits on the availability of pornography, right? So there are various aspects of social issues that are incorporated into it as well. Again, using federal government to affect that sort of change.
And Project 2025 is nearly 900 pages long. So, yes, that was a quick summary. But a review by CBS News found in those 900 pages, at least 270 proposals match Trump's current or past policies and campaign promises. How much is this going to play a role in his second administration?
I think it's less about how much of a role Project 2025 is going to play than the extent to which Project 2025 represents what it is those who are going to be empowered by a Trump administration, how much of what they're going to do is predictable based on that, right? So it was always the case for as many times as Donald Trump tried to distance himself from Project 2025. The issue was always that Donald Trump is not someone who pays close attention to the details of policy and to policy proposals. It was always up to other people who were going to implement a lot of the things that he wanted to do or to implement their own agendas once they were empowered by him. That's what happened during his first administration. And so it was always a question less of, is he going to take Project 2025 and make it happen, than the people who wrote Project 2025 are writing down what it is they want to do, and those are likely to be people who could then serve in Trump's administration. Yes, there are some direct parallels, as you just stated, but the real issue is that Donald Trump himself is going to leave a lot of the governance of the federal government to other people, and this is those people, a lot of those people saying, here's what I want to do with that power.
We're slowly learning what the next administration could look like. Last night, he named co-campaign manager Susie Wiles as his chief of staff. This morning, his other campaign manager, Chris LaCivita, told CBS News he doesn't intend to be part of the next administration. What insight are we getting into how he's beginning to shape his team?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the extent to which he leans into the sort of fringe right and far right world of personalities that really bolstered his campaign, right? So on the campaign trail, he repeatedly talked about how Elon Musk was going to be in charge of this government efficiency commission and how RFK Jr. Was going to be in charge of various aspects of health. Well, now the rubber's meeting the road, right? Now he actually has to put together an administration, and it's going to be interesting to see how much of that was just campaign trail rhetoric. He is already not going to be able to seek another term in office. So, he is not necessarily beholden to his campaign promises in the ways that he once was. He could simply just not put RFK Jr. in any position or give him some, push him to the side. And so we're going to see a lot of that sort of balance, like how much of the loud voices that helped him win this election are actually going to end up in positions of power, and how much is it going to be other people maybe with murkier backgrounds, and not necessarily meaning that pejoratively, but people who are less well known and have less loud voices who end up serving in administration. And we're just going to have to wait and see.
Philip Bump, thank you. Good to talk to you.